So welcome everyone to this session. This is the breakout session number 3, entitled Solitary Confinement, Peers Leading a Path Towards Elimination. And this great team of presenters is led by Howard Trachtman. My name is Kathy Cash. I am N.A.P.S, National Association of Peer Supporters board members. My pronouns are her, or she, her, and hers. For those who may be listening to the session, I'm African American, brown skin, I'm wearing glasses, and I'm wearing purple in support of Intimate Partner Violence Day, Recognition Day. Okay. So we have enabled closed captions during this event. So please click on the CC box in your Zoom toolbar to find the option to enable captions individually. We request that during this presentation, attendees utilize the chat box to network, to comment on the session, and to interact. Please utilize the Q&A box feature to ask questions. We want to make sure we have the ability to see all of the questions asked. So we ask that you use the Q&A box rather than the chat box. And please note this session is being recorded. And before we move on, we'd like to take a moment and thank our sponsors without whom none of this conference would be possible. We have a huge thank you in particular to our full conference sponsor, Marigold Health. Please make sure to visit the virtual exhibit hall, which you can find on our conference page under the sponsors tab. So without further ado, I welcome to you our featured presenters for this session. We will start with Howard Trachtman.
Hello, I'm Howard Trachtman, an individual that's been restrained and secluded many times in psychiatric settings. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I am wearing a suit jacket over a dress shirt and a hat of the Metro Boston Recovery Learning Community, a peer-run organization that I co-founded. This is very personal to me because of my own experience in restraint and seclusion, but we have some really excellent co-presenters today. We have 2 individuals that have suffered with significant amounts of solitary confinement, and they will be telling their personal stories as well as what we can do to stop this horrific practice from continuing. First, I'll be introducing Kenneth Helberg from, and after that, we will be hearing from Dr. Terry Coopers. Dr. Coopers literally wrote the book, Solitary, the Inside Story of Supermax Isolation and How We Can Abolish It. So put in a little plug for his book. When my presentation is over, I'm going to put into the chat some of the links of some of the websites and resources that I'm going to share verbally. So you'll have that information in the chat. A lot of this workshop is on the emotional impact of solitary confinement, because call it what it is. People in the correctional world sometimes use other acronyms like SHU, Specialized Housing Unit, or restrictive housing, but they're just euphemisms. And the solitary confinement, it exacerbates mental health if you have it already, and it creates mental health problems if you haven't had them. And you'll be hearing more about that from the other presenters. How I got into the restraint and seclusion world is I had my first psychotic break when I was at MIT, and I had to change planes, and I became psychotic. I called my parents, and they brought me to a crisis center, and I had no real previous mental health treatment of any kind. And then the doctor asked me a very simple question. Do you hear voices? Well, sure, I hear voices. I hear people talking. When I told him I hear voices, not knowing what he really meant, I immediately found myself put into 4-point seclusion and injected with Haldol. At the time, I called it the time travel drug because my mind was just so out of control. And luckily, they discharged me in the morning, and then I spent a couple weeks in another hospital for a couple weeks, but was never restrained or secluded at all. And I had forgotten about the initial restraint in the crisis center. So I returned back to Massachusetts after going back to school there, and I started to have problems again. And I ended up in a state hospital for 9 months. I had real issues there, but I was never put into mechanical restraint. I was once given an injection when I was really anxious about my parents coming up to visit me. I did spend a lot of time into seclusion rooms. Most of the time was in locked door seclusion because they would put me into the open quiet room. And then I wanted fresh air. I'd push the door open for fresh air, and then they'd lock the door. And this went on repeatedly a lot. It happened a lot, especially when one particular staff would come on Fridays. I always end up in the quiet room, and it stopped me from getting privileges. But finally, after months of being debriefed with these restraint seclusions, finally someone said, you know, if you didn't push the door open, we wouldn't lock it. It didn't occur to me that's why that was happening. And that information would have been very helpful. But the bottom line is that the state hospital wasn't using that much restraint and seclusion on me. My next series of hospitalizations, I was in an open unit. I was transferred to another hospital with a great reputation. They put me into the open quiet room, and I should have learned my lesson, but I didn't. I came out of the open quiet room and told them I'm calling my parents to see, let them know where I was. And then they pushed me back into the seclusion room and they locked the door. I didn't understand why they locked the door. I knocked on the door and they go, you're trying to hurt yourself. And they immediately put me into restraints again. And I can't understand this, how people can get so hurt and traumatized and put in restraints, and it's supposed to be for your own good to prevent yourself from harm. I just didn't get it. Later in that hospital stay, I met one of my best friends, and we did okay in the community for a while, but eventually he got re-hospitalized there, and he called me up to visit him. And I went to try to visit him, and they said, you can't visit him, you have to call the family. And I called the family, and they said that John is dead. He died in restraints there. So I became very passionate about this. I created a website that I'll put in the chat later called Restraint Free World, where we're challenging the use of restraint and seclusion in any other setting. Later on, I got connected with the people from the Kevin Huckshorn and people from NASPID, the National Association of Program Directors. They are the trade association for all the state mental health commissioners. And they put right up on their website for everyone to see that the use of restraint and seclusion is not treatment, but treatment failure. And Kevin put together what's now called the 6 core strategies for reducing seclusion and restraint use. I will drop into the chat later a link to the PDF. But the 6 core strategies are leadership towards organizational change, the use of data to inform practice, workforce development, the use of seclusion restraint prevention tools, consumer roles in inpatient setting, and debriefing techniques. So I set the stage for what I want to talk a little bit more about that. The workshop is about what peers are doing. We piloted it at the recovery learning community, the use of peers in places where people are evaluated. We have something called urgent care centers that serve people in crisis, but it's not a hospital where you're competing with people with physical health problems or broken arms. It's just exclusively for psychiatric. But we piloted the use of peers there and being with people when they come in. I came on the shift one time. There was a woman who was like putting on makeup with the peer and laughing, and everything was fine. And she says, you know, before I had a peer just to be with me, I ended up getting restrained, and now I don't need to get restrained because I have a peer. We've tried to grow that program. Danica Hodis, who'd been organizing the Boston chapter of our peer-run organization, and I took the N.A.P.S training in Philadelphia, and Denise became the first in the nation peer debriefer in the country. And she told one little vignette just by debriefing people and asking them what happened to them, or what could have been done differently, what could the staff have done differently, what could you have done differently. And she just said, well, you know what, it's very hard to be in isolation. What I really would need is just, you know, having a hard time, I just like to play with the dollhouse. And they were like, okay, let's give that a try. And they ended up doing that. They bought her dollhouse, let her play with it when she wanted, and restraints and seclusions pretty much stopped. So there's a lot of good success stories. What are peer debriefers doing nationally? Many of you may be familiar with protection and advocacy organizations, but some of you may not. So I'll just give an overview. The federal government funds a protection and advocacy organization in every state and territory in the District of Columbia. And they're typically done by a legal type organization, which has attorneys on staff. And the federal statute gives these attorneys the ability to go into institutions and advocate on behalf of clients that they identify or people that have contacted them. And abuse and neglect is one of the top priorities, and many of these P&As do work on restraint and seclusion or solitary confinement. The chair of the protection advocacy, each P&A has a PAMI advisory council that stands, this is federal language, not mine, protection and advocacy for individuals with mental illness. And like I said, there's one in every state and territory. On the NDRN website, it's the trade association of all of the protection and advocacy organizations. You can find your local P&A to get involved. They're required to have a chair of that council needs to be an individual with lived experience of mental health. And there's some other mandated positions as well. So we encourage everybody to check out their local P&A and find out what they're doing or not doing and try to get involved. That would be my recommendation. There's some excellent legislation in New York that just got passed called HALT. However, the correctional officers are against this, and it's just give a lot of resistance to the legislation. We want things to have really significantly changed. We don't want a place that was locking people up for 23 hours a day, every day or longer, to be able to say, okay, well, we gave them an extra half an hour of rec time today, so they're not in solitary because they're not in the cell for more than 23 hours. So this really has to change. And what is of interest here is what can be done to prevent people from ending up in criminal justice system and solitary confinement. And you'll hear more from our other presenters on this. But when you talk about diversion, diverting people from jails and prisons, what do you divert them to? Where can people go? So we have these places people can go in crisis, but we need more peer-run places like peer-run respites and peer-run organizations that can provide peer support to people that may be being sent to an emergency room or a jail or prison. And a lot of our work is around the advocacy work that we'll be doing. We'll be hearing next from Kenneth Helberg with his personal experiences with solitary and the emotional impact. Also talk more about advocacy. Next, we'll hear more from Dr. Coopers on alternatives to solitary. And Micah will share his personal experience with solitary and advocacy, and hope to hear a little bit more about the use of forensic peer specialist. So if you have burning questions for the Q&A, if they're burning, we may answer them, but we were planning on taking all questions at the end. Everyone was going to speak for about 10 minutes. That should leave room for 15 minutes at the end. I'll drop some websites into the chat and take a look at it and see if there's questions we can answer. But thanks for attending this important workshop. It is really a matter of life and death. The UN has said that the use of restraint and seclusion is torture if it exceeds 15 days. A 2017 review study, a robust scientific literature has established the negative psychological effects of solitary confinement, including a consensus among the correctional as well as professional health, legal, and human rights organizations to drastically limit the use of solitary confinement. And you can find more at Wikipedia. Thank you for your time. And next, it's my great honor and privilege to introduce Kenneth Helberg.
I'd like to thank everyone for being here and participating. I am a white individual wearing a black shirt, polo. I am 46 years of age. My solitary confinement and isolation started very young. I was traumatically abused sexually, physically, and emotionally by my own parents and grandfather. A lot of my solitary confinement and isolation happened with them. I became a ward of the state when I was 6 years old. I was put into a state hospital and basically put into seclusion because I had rage. I would have people walk up behind me or touch me or trigger me at that point in time in my life. It was hard. I did old school ECTs back when I was 6 to 10 years old. I was a ward of the state. The state determined what happened to me. The state said what direction to go and what to do with me. I didn't know how to cope. My voices started, and no one believed at that age that I should be in that predicament or that circumstance. Because of my rage and acting out, as they called it, I would get very angry and very physically abusive towards anyone trying to control or manipulate me. The best way that they would find is what I used to call the steel room. They would put me in a room that was literally stainless steel, lock me in there, and time would fly. Not absolutely fly, but that's what they felt. I didn't know the direction to go at that age. I didn't know where to go at that age or what to direct it to. It became me and my voices, me and conversations, which alerted them to things that I shouldn't be doing, shouldn't be seeing, or shouldn't be hearing, which led to me being restrained and basically a cart with two wheels on it, put into a straitjacket and held for people just to look at me and stare. No one knew what direction I was in or where I was at. I was diagnosed at that time with manic depressive and anger issues. In this whole process of going through being in dark areas, not allowed to see people, not allowed to converse, not allowed to talk, not allowed to communicate, I found it in myself to make what I called my family. It would go for weeks at a time, not to mention the fact that at that time I was enrolled in school, which I was in a behavioral health class. And if I acted out or did anything wrong, I was put into a little closet and left there. My point of this is, it doesn't have to be this way. I found at 10 years old that when someone came to me and said, "What's going on? What are you feeling? what's your emotions? They had found out at that age that I was traumatically, physically, sexually, and emotionally abused. That's what was causing my triggers. That's what was causing my anger, along with not being able to communicate because of the dark rooms and non-physical activity that I would have. Howard spoke of, and I'm sure my other colleagues will speak of, having rec time, having time out. Mine was being put in front of a window and them taking the covering off, letting me see outside, but I was still inside. You may say at this point, how or why? I didn't know at that point. My time became very my own in per se, because that's what I had, was my time. I had my imagination and my voices. I had the visual and auditory hallucinations that I was occurring and got louder and louder. I learned to caress them and bring them into myself and push my way through, because that's what I needed. When that didn't work and I did get upset and my anger would come out, um, again, as I had said, I'd be restrained. Restraining consisted of either a straitjacket, a cart, or being restrained to my bed, which had nothing on it but just a very slim bedding, and I wasn't allowed any sheets or anything. They gave me a small pillow that was a foot by maybe a foot. I had nothing to push myself through because nobody understood me. Everyone wanted me to fall into their plan. This wasn't right. I tried to explain and tried to tell them that I just needed other people, my love for someone to feel that I was there in order to work my way through, so I didn't act out anymore. But my acting out still got me into isolation. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go because it was hard to push through in a very dark hole that I was put in with no communication. My point on this is, yes, I've went through it. I have relived that experience and coming down with COVID a year and a little over a year ago, when I was put into isolation. My mental thoughts came back, everything came back, and then I was put inpatient in isolation because I had COVID. I couldn't believe this was still going on and pushing through. How can you still continue to do this how many years later? My push through was having a peer, having someone there that could talk to me and relate with me and understand what I was telling in a story, understand where I was, and possibly not know what it was like, but give me that empathy, which pushed me through. I can't go back and change. I can't go back and do anything. All I can do is do what I'm doing and speak and tell my story, which helps others to know that this is not right. You, as a person with a mental illness or lived experience, live through what you live through to help others. And that's what I feel that I can do, as well as peers should do for us as well as others. Be there. I, in the past year, have added to my PAD that when I do go into psychosis, and I am in psychosis or in that circumstance, that I have a relationship with a peer, that I have communication with a peer, and that I'm able to talk with them and be able to relate and push through. That's what I'm trying to help others do. That is a much needed process. I would not be in recovery in amongst the numerous diagnoses I have and things that I've lived through without being given the chance to know what a peer is and what they can do with their own lived experience. And that's what I'm asking you all to do. Or if you have a story, to share it, to be there for someone that someone may have thought, hey, you know, they're just at that point where they can't be helped. Ask them what's wrong. Ask them what's going on. Ask them what helps. Ask them what pushes them through. And that will help you and them both help the mental health, cooperative, and meaning to push through. I thank you all for this. This is a very huge opportunity. I am very privileged to be with the gentleman that I am presenting with. And please listen to their stories, listen to what is going on, and let's make a difference and fight what shouldn't be done anywhere, whether it be in a hospital or a jail or wherever it may be. Let's find out what's going on with that particular person in their life to help them push through. We're all here together to do what we need to do with our lived experience. My last thing is this. I've always looked at my lived experience before my recovery as pain and very traumatic things that I had to go through and question why. I became a peer. I became someone to help others and talk to others through different organizations and different certifications. And please, just take that time, if you see that, to give them an opportunity and talk. Sometimes that's all they need. Thank you. And I would like to turn it over to Terry. And thank you guys so much. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm very privileged. Thank you.
Ken, thank you. That is such a chilling story. Thank you for your courage in telling it. And it does help that you share that story. Howard, you for sharing your story too. Thank you. I'm a white psychiatrist, he, him. I am working to end solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is torture. Some of the other things Ken mentioned and Howard are torture as well, but solitary is the standout and is the organizing point of the torture. I'm very excited about peer support work. I have a concern about incarceration in general and also hospitalization, that the focus is singularly on compliance, supposedly because people act in an unusual way or break rules. The authorities that lock them up want them to comply with every single little detailed rule, and it breaks people. It turns them into automatons who have no inertia, no initiative to do things that are creative. We need to change that. Peer support is a great way to do that. Peer support, I think, has at least two parts. One part is you have someone to talk to who treats you like a human being with respect, and so there's meaning in your life. The second thing is advocacy. Even within a total lockdown situation, when you're in solitary confinement, there are rules. And when your keepers break the rules, you can complain and you can file lawsuits. Jailhouse lawyers are peer supporters. They're fellow prisoners who advocate for other prisoners, and they learn the law so that they can do that. Also, peer supporters who come into the institution. There's a lot of research on solitary confinement. I've done a bunch of it. There are massive symptoms and dysfunction, very high anxiety, thinking disorders, including paranoia, massive problems remembering and concentrating, despair leading to depression. Suicide rate is sky high in solitary confinement. When people are in solitary for a long time, and I'm talking about years, they develop two general constellations of symptoms that I've written about. One is extreme isolation. That is, they seek isolation even more than their situation requires. The other is numbing of feelings. I think what's going on is that people get very angry in these situations, but they want to suppress their anger because they don't want to get in trouble with their keepers, the guards or the attendants, whatever. So they suppress their anger. And when they suppress their anger, they suppress all the other feelings too, and they become numb. They tell me they feel like zombies or walking dead. And these are both extremely toxic effects of solitary confinement. So there's the research. The alternative, let's abolish solitary confinement. And that's not a pie in the sky. There's a movement all around the country to do that. And let's decarcerate radically. We don't need 2.5 million people behind bars. They're only there because this society does not want to satisfy people's needs. We've cut the social welfare safety net programs, and one side of Congress is in favor of doing that even more today. And then the people that are most damaged by that are locked up in hospitals and jails and prisons. We need to end that. We need to empty out those jails and prisons. And that means establish programs to help people with what they need. Often what they need is education. They need work skills. They need humane social support. They need people who care about them, who treat them with respect, to talk to them and work with them. And we need to provide programs. So, for instance, one step in that direction is diversion. Behavioral health courts sort of facilitate that. And then we need programs in the community where people can go for help. And we need to fund those generously, which is unclear if this society has the will to do that. But that's what we need to do. I think an immediate step is to end solitary. When you cannot put people in solitary confinement, you have to figure out some other way to deal with them. And the first thing is you have to talk to them, treat them with respect as human beings, figure out what they need. If they need some kind of mental health treatment, if they need some kind of vocational training, education, give it to them. I'm always very impressed when I enter prisons and jails, and I've done that and talked to thousands of people inside. Very intelligent people, most of whom dropped out of school because of emotional problems or poverty or trauma. Trauma is a big one. So we need to supply services that help them with those dilemmas. How to survive. You know, I'm always impressed by, my research shows that solitary is extremely damaging and that it exacerbates mental illness. So if someone who hears voices or is paranoid goes into solitary, and that just multiplies. The voices get louder and more frequent. The paranoia gets larger. It exacerbates every form of mental illness. The suicide rate is sky high in solitary because it exacerbates the despair. So one way to, I'm always impressed by the people who come out unharmed by it. For instance, the Angola three prisoners that were in solitary for up to 40 years at Angola State Prison in Louisiana. Albert Woodfox is one of them, the last to be released, and he wrote a book titled Solitary, which I recommend to everybody. First of all, it's a brilliant book, but second of all, he always knew what was going on. He knew it was unfair. He knew that they were trying to shame him and blame him for his situation being in prison, but he didn't accept that. A Black man, he said, this is about slavery and racism, and he continued to analyze that and speak out. And he maintained his stability. So I recommend that to everybody. The key points are not to blame ourselves. Self-blame is the undoing of people in solitary. You're sitting there all alone. You're saying, what caused this horrible situation? I did. I messed up. You have to knock that off, and peer supporters help a lot with that. And the other is to think about the future. The common denominator for people who really fall apart in solitary is they've lost sight of the future, of the prize. But if you can, first of all, understand the unfairness of it all, understand that it's not right and that you have to work out a way to get out of here, not blame yourself, and maintain a vision of the future, which involves your freedom, I think you do much better. I think peers are invaluable in doing that. So I really am excited about this meeting and this whole project. I think I'll stop there.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for allowing me to be on this panel. I'm honored to be on this panel, actually. I'm going to go in a slightly different order from everybody else, so I hope you'll indulge me a little bit. My name is Micah Pearson, and I'm the executive director of NAMI Southern New Mexico. I'm also a member of the NAMI National Board. Specifically, I chair the Public Policy Committee, and I am a biracial Black man and a person with bipolar, type 1, rapid cycling, and a smattering of other mental health conditions. I'm telling you all this because I'm also a domestic abuse survivor. And whenever I called the police about what was happening in my home, the only thing that mattered to the police were the latter two things that I mentioned. That's why I wanted to tell it to you in that specific order. And since I only have a few minutes to talk to you and they wanted me to cover a wide variety of subject matters, I'm only gonna briefly talk about what I experienced when I was in solitary confinement. So when I'm actually pretty lucky and privileged. And so when I was arrested, my family actually called my uncle, who was a retired police officer, and he went to the police and he told them that, you know, my nephew lives with some severe mental health conditions and here's his medications, please give them to him. And they said, we can't because, you know, they didn't come from us. So they're not in our formulary. We can't give them to him. So instead they locked me in a holding cell where they couldn't turn the lights off and there were no windows. So I couldn't tell the passage of time. And so let me share with you, I was asked to share with you what I saw within the first 24 hours of being there. Within the first 24 hours, I figured out later it was 24 hours. That's what I saw. Within 72 hours, Freddy Krueger, who actually is a much nicer person than you would think he is, came by to help me deal with that. And he spent some time with me to help me deal with that. And then he went away and that kept coming on down. And then after an indeterminate period of time, because I couldn't keep track of time while I was in there, they transferred me to a psychiatric unit. So, and then I was kept in solitary confinement for another couple of days when I was there. That was 10 years ago. And I still have a hard time telling that story. But I do tell that story. And that's part of what peers can do. And that's actually the main thrust of what I'm supposed to talk with you today. How can we change the system to make sure that this doesn't happen again? And that's why I told you the former part of who I am. The executive director of NAMI Southern New Mexico and a member of the national board. I'm there because of that story, and that's what we can do. So I want to share with you a letter that I received earlier this year because of that story. I testified in Colorado at the state legislature on HB 21-1211, which was a bill to limit the application, actually eliminate the application of solitary confinement on people with mental health conditions, except unfortunately in cases where they are an immediate threat to self or others. You love that designation, don't you? I just wanted to thank you for all of your help, support, and advocacy on HB 21-1211. Your voice and testimony were powerful when I was considering on making amendments to pacify the Colorado Sheriff's Association. I would watch your film on solitary confinement, and it helped me stay resolute and helped me stay focused on our goal, protecting people. It was a pleasure to meet you. If you're ever in Denver, please reach out. In gratitude. That bill passed, and the legislature was very clear that it was mine and another individual who shared his story, where he was kept in solitary confinement for over 1.5 years, and he gouged his own eyes out, and nobody noticed for 1.5 weeks. That's why they passed the bill. And it's the work that we're doing elsewhere. The fact that our organization in Southern New Mexico has a program called Peer Support Navigators, where we help peers who are in the criminal justice system or who are lost in the behavioral health system navigate those systems to find supports. Or we go into the detention facilities and we do what Ken was mentioning, keep them company. We talk to them. We actually work with the detention facilities, the court systems, the legal systems to make sure these individuals do not get placed in those the solitary confinement in those systems, or if they do, they are not there alone, left to rot or see shadow demons walking down and crawling down. That's the power of our stories. That's the power of who we are. So what can we do in addition to that? The one thing is that we are way too much focusing on who we are as behavioral health providers in the behavioral health system. So I want to focus on us not being a unicorn in the legislative areas. I noticed, and he said so when he came in as an attendee, Rayleigh. Hi, Rayleigh. Rayleigh recently joined the NAMI National Board, and he's on the Public Policy Committee with me. And I'm very proud of that because that means he's going to be a force for change in public policy eventually. And that's great because he's going to be on the Public Policy Committee after I'm gone. We need more forces for change at the national level to be forces for change in public policy. So I don't want to be a shiny unicorn by myself. We need more of us. So stand up, rise up, and join us. Raise your voices, tell your stories, and walk with us. Thank you. We'll take questions now.
I have a question in the Q&A for Dr. Coopers on what do you do with peers in for-profit prisons, and then Michael Weaver put something in chat about extreme cases and getting to zero use of solitary, and you alluded to that already, Micah.
It's a very good question, and whenever I talk in a public forum, I always have to address the safety issue. Yes, we need safety. We shouldn't let people run amok and hurt people. However, we have social ways to do that. First of all, the individuals who are actually dangerous, as you all know, are extremely rare. What the system does is it takes the few rare cases where someone is very extremely upset and strikes out at people, and then they build a system for that person, which they then put everybody else in. And that's solitary confinement. When you go into solitary confinement, these are supposed to be the worst of the worst in the correction system. They're not. They're very ordinary people. A lot of them are there because either they're Black, they have a mental disorder, or they're very smart. And officers are intimidated by smart prisoners. So they sock them or hit them with their stick and throw them in solitary. So the first thing is that the situations where someone is out of control and needs to be forcefully controlled are extremely rare. Second, what we do with them now causes them to be more extremely out of control. You put someone like that in shackles or shackle them to a bed or put them in solitary. In terms of future activity, they're not going to get better. They're going to continue to be out of control and need a lot of safety measures. the best way to help someone who's out of control, they're out of control for a reason. I don't care how out of touch with reality, presumably they are. They have a reason for being upset. Let's find it out. Let's talk to them. Let's find out what they're so upset about. Yes, we need to institute immediate control. I suggest no solitary, no restraints, just that people surround them and say, hey, buddy, not okay to act like that. Tell me what's up. And that we do that with people rather than bars and chains. And then we have programs. There are actually books about this. Hans Tock wrote a book called Acting Out. And one of the first things he says is when someone is that far out of control, they need more staff, and I would add peers, involved in their management. In other words, something's way out of kilter for them. We need to move in on them and figure out what that is and solve the problem that they're reacting to. If we do that, there's much, much less violence in the institutions where it happens.
I would like to add to that, actually. In most cases, there's many studies out there that demonstrate that solitary confinement exacerbates the issues more than that actually ameliorates. And when I was testifying in Colorado, the sheriff's departments freely admitted that they use solitary confinement as the stick approach in the carrot and stick discussion. So they're not even considering it really as a safety measure. They want to use it as a punishment tool. So so I wouldn't even talk about it in that terms. The safety concern is usually rooted in stigma, and that's really what we're talking about here.
I would exactly agree with both of you. If someone would have came to me and asked me what was going on with me at home and why I was acting out and why I had anger and why it proceededly continued to get worse, it was because of being in solitary and no one caring. Nobody wanted to hear why I was there or why I was acting out. And that's why I like to stress, in those cases, take your time, especially as a peer, to listen and ask. Because being that person in a lived experience, a person that has went through it, you're a lot more trusting than what you think you are. And give them that time and find out what's going on, and it'll solve it.
So I would I'd like to address Gabriella's. I would like to at least call out Gabriella's statement in the chat. I worked in the correctional facility many years ago, and things I saw, I'd log things down and then got treated as an outcast and was punished for not being on their team by putting me in crappy posts. That's the thing that you want to call out with your local health and human services department, because they are the ones, health and human services are the ones that are working on diversionary programs and systems change. Law enforcement departments and correctional facilities sometimes butt heads by developing law enforcement assisted diversion programs. I found in my work, I do a lot of forensic peer support, and I found in my work that county-run corrections facilities really don't want our populations in their facilities. Now, as was mentioned earlier, private facilities are a human rights violation, and they're completely different. So they tend to work with us in trying to keep folks out. We work on diversionary programs, and police departments frequently work with us on programs to keep people out again. What was the organization again? Health and Human Services. Because Health and Human Services departments are directly invested in public health programs to keep overall community health costs down. So since they can demonstrate that strong behavioral health systems programs like crisis triage centers, and I know I'm going to catch flack for this, but if you get peers involved in the strategic planning and treatment aspect, but quality AOT programs, if you can get them involved in quality versions of these programs, you can keep overall behavioral health systems costs down. a good, strong health and human services program organization will actually keep more folks out of prison. But if you log your concerns with the Health and Human Services Department, that's actually good leverage for them to go to their county councils, thank you, county councils, to actually argue for stronger behavioral health programs to keep folks out of those detention facilities. That was a long-winded answer. I apologize. I warned you guys that I get long-winded.
Micah, you indicated you wanted to answer the question in the chat. I'm sorry, in the Q&A?
No, I was specifically looking at Gabriela Gallegos in her comment about how she was getting punished for what she was noticing in the detention facilities.
Okay, so in the Q&A box, there's a question for Mr. Kroopers.
I thought she actually got that, that we answered that already. So my
Okay.
bad. I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Very good.
Terry, did you see that?
So that
Yeah.
Terry's email bounced.
Well, read the question. I don't know what you're talking about.
Are there different strategies as we as peers can use in abolishing solitary confinement and other harmful practices in for-profit prisons versus state-run facilities?
Well, Micah, you mentioned a key issue, which is that there is a self-interest in private facilities, also private contractors who supply mental health and medical care, as well as the food suppliers and the construction people. It's called the prison industrial complex. They make money by having more prisons where people stay longer so they get paid more. And that's an extremely nefarious development in this country and has to be stopped. And that requires legislation. We have to work at all levels. We have to work in terms of social activism. We have to work in terms of legislation. We have to go to our professional organizations. I was just on a panel earlier today at a psychiatric training center. We have to go to our colleagues and say, this isn't right, what's going on. And it has to be a multifaceted approach. That's what's going on in Colorado. That's where Micah testified to the legislature. Well, it took a lot of community activists and a lot of peers to make that happen in the legislature. So we have to launch a public campaign. Meanwhile, we have to try to help the people that are most harmed by the current practices. And that's what we've been mainly talking about today, but we could also talk about the social movement that's needed.
So sorry about that. I thought we covered that. That was my bad. Are there any other questions? We really want to make sure we cover everything.
So we wanted Terry's email address. What she put there bounced.
Let me just add one more there's a few comments about very dangerous people. I've been practicing psychiatry for almost 50 years. I've met maybe 2 or 3 people I can't sit down in a room with and chat. And it has to do with paying some respect, with getting to the issue. I'm not anti-guard. I work with guards. I don't work in a prison, but I go into prisons to investigate for class action lawsuits. If a guard tells me you don't want to be in a room with that guy, and the guard is being sincere, I listen to them and I say, what are we going to do? And I'll turn to the guy and I'll say, hey, the guard says I can't be in the room with you. Is that true about you? Do you like having a reputation like that? And if they decide to talk to me, I know I'm safe. If I say that to a prisoner and he says, no, you're right, the guard's just smearing me, I don't want to hurt anybody, I'll go in the room and sit with them without the guard. So there's you have to be realistic about some people who are dangerous. They're extremely rare. We should not be building 1,000-bed supermax prisoners to handle the 1 or 2 prisoners who are out of control.
I would totally agree with that. In 10 years of doing the work in detention facilities, I have run into exactly 0 people that were so dangerous that I couldn't sit down and work with them. You know, and I'm not the biggest guy in the history of ever, and I'm not so intimidating that they won't work with me. The biggest thing that I learned, actually, especially in a courtroom, was don't ever go in a courtroom in a suit. That was the biggest thing I learned. Was I go in button down and jeans, and then that's when I stopped scaring the clients in the courtroom. That's it. That was the only thing. When I stopped wearing a suit, they stopped getting angry when I was talking to them. That was it. That was all I had to learn. So there you go. There's my pro tip for the day.
There was a question for me, I guess. Yes, we do a lot of work on restraint and seclusion in schools. We actually did a workshop at N.A.P.S when it was in Philadelphia 4 or 5 years ago, and Michael Weaver, who's in the chat here, as one of the co-presenters, along with Charlie Curie. And there was legislation called the Keeping All Students Safe Act that a lot of work went into it on the federal level, but it ultimately didn't go through. But that's very, very important. I would think that the protection and advocacy organizations also might be interested in what's going on in schools. Here's the deal. It's way underreported for a lot of reasons. One of them is this: kid goes to school, gets sent to a closet all day, doors locked, comes home. He doesn't come home and say, "Mom and Dad, I was secluded in a closet." They're like, "I went to school." They don't even understand what's happening to them or why, or that it's restraint and seclusion in many cases. And I could go on and on about that.
And I would like to add, if I could, very quickly, I was 6 years old when I first raged. I was 6. Come on, people. They put me as high risk. They put me as I was going to take out the guards and the people in the state hospital. It's give them time, and exactly what I said in my story, and exactly what Terry said and Micah has said. Ask them what's going on. Give them empathy and sympathy. Give them a chance just to tell you what's going on. I very quickly went through behavioral court when I first found my recovery 6 years ago. And I agree with Micah. I got put into behavioral court, and it was totally different. It wasn't what I was scared of because I went through what I went through when I was young. And if you give them the time and talk to them, no matter how big or small they are, a lot of the times they will give you their time, and you can figure out what's going on, and they can be an extreme resource to helping what we're trying to fix here today.
Since I'm a slow typist with my wrist being the way it is, I would like to add that a lot of that restraint, seclusion, and labeling that goes on in schools right now is rooted in lack of cultural competency and systemic racism. So a lot of work has to be done there. So we have to really talk about that, and we have to open those conversations and start those conversations. NAMI National's starting to have those conversations with their justice, equity, and diversion and inclusion. Yes, I know what that acronym is, but we really have to talk about that.
And as we have less than a minute remaining for this webinar, we'd like to thank our speakers and our attendees. There is one question that we'll pass on to the speakers because due to time and everyone having to go to the next session, we do have to end this session. But again, we thank you to all of our speakers, to Howard, Micah, Kenneth, Terry. We thank you all for the information that you shared. And to all of our attendees, thank you so much for being here and being a great audience and presenting great questions. And please, please, please go on to another session and continue doing what you're doing today, as we are not only celebrating Global Peer Support Celebration Day, but we are celebrating each other in unity. So thank you so much, and everyone have a great rest of the conference.
Thank you, Kathy, for helping out.
You are so welcome, everyone. Thank you.